Welcome to The Origin of Species, a brief introduction to evolution. What I'm going to do in this PowerPoint is look through Darwin's book by the same name and present to you some of his chapters and then give some updated information from the evidence that he provided for evolution. And let's begin with a little light humor. A cartoon from the far side, and when we get further on in the this video, you'll see there's actually a creature that kind of fits this bill, but I don't think they played baseball. But let's move on and talk a little bit about Charles Darwin. Born February 12th, 1809, exact same day as Abraham Lincoln, and in many parts of the world, Lincoln is known as some guy that was born on Charles Darwin's birthday. There are countries like Australia that celebrate Darwin's Day. It's not exactly a holiday, but it is a celebration of Darwin's life. And so Darwin was born into a very wealthy family in England, and he wasn't quite Bill Gates rich, but quite wealthy, and his family was also very liberal. And one of the causes that they took up was the cause of slavery. Slavery was abolished in England, I believe, in the mid or late 1700s, and then on British territory in the 1830s. And one of the people who was instrumental in getting slavery abolished in England and the English territories was Darwin's grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood of Wedgwood china fame. And he produced this medallion, this anti-slavery medallion, which says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And so Darwin was very influenced by his family, and one of the driving factors for him in his pursuit of evidence for evolution was to prove that all people on Earth are brothers and sisters and closely related. That wasn't a very popular idea in Darwin's day. It was thought that Africans and other non-whites were less than human, or subhuman, or maybe even a different species. But Darwin wanted to prove that bad notion wrong, and he did convince a lot of people. And today we know by genetic studies that all humans are 99.9% the same. We're actually a rather inbred species, and so there's really no such concept as race in a genetic sense. We're just too closely related. So here's Darwin. I think he's 44 at this time, and this was a while before excuse me, the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. And it was a bestseller for a science book, and within a few years of its publication, most thinking people were convinced of the fact of evolution, but not so much the theory he presented, natural selection. And we'll talk about why that was later on. And so here's what we're going to be going through in this video PowerPoint. We're going to start with a discussion of natural selection, and then get into the chapters of Darwin's book: artificial selection, taxonomy, fossil record, biogeography, homology, imperfections, and he even had a chapter for challenges to his theory, so things that required more research. And then we'll talk a little bit about the reception of his book and his ideas, and then his other big idea, sexual selection. turns out not everything can be explained by natural selection, and there are some things that can be explained only by sexual selection. And when we get there, we'll talk about that. Okay, so natural selection first. And Darwin presented what have been called his postulates, and there are 5 of those. And the first one is all populations have the potential to overproduce. And Darwin did a calculation that if elephants could reproduce unimpeded by any factors, that within 500 years there'd be 5 million elephants on the earth. And that's a pretty impressive number. Unfortunately, it's wrong. As a famous famous physicist pointed out, Lord Kelvin, Darwin got his mathematics wrong. Had Darwin extended that calculation to 1,000 years, then it would have been actually more impressive and correct, because there would have been tens of millions of elephants on the earth. So something stops populations from overproducing. And this is limited resources. Limited resources prevent infinite increases in population. And so the term resources is very broad. It includes food, it includes territory, it includes mating opportunities, it includes predation. So there's lots of resources in an environment that can be limiting, and it will prevent increases in populations. And right now we're talking about natural populations. Because there are limited resources, individuals must compete for those resources. So if there's not enough territory, then animals are going to fight for that territory, push them out. Someone's going to get pushed out. And so there are limited resources, and so individuals must compete for those resources. And then individuals with variations that allow them to better compete for resources tend to survive and reproduce at a higher frequency. So in other words, there's no guarantees. Even though an individual may have a variation that makes them in some sense better at competing for resources, that doesn't guarantee they're going to survive and reproduce at a higher frequency. There are chance events that could come along. An elephant tragically could be killed by a poacher or by a hunter. Unfortunately, elephant hunts are still legal in certain countries. And so an elephant with some variations that make them superior at gathering resources might get a bullet in the head, and that would be the end of them, and they wouldn't pass on their genes at a higher frequency to pass on those traits. And then so if these variations are heritable, future generations of individuals will, with that successful variation, will tend to exist at a higher frequency. And so this just all makes sense. So limited resources prevent infinite increases in populations, and because there are limited resources, there's competition for those resources. Individuals that have variations that allow them to better compete will survive and reproduce at a higher frequency. And if those variations are heritable, future generations will inherit those successful traits. And so those traits will exist at a higher frequency in the future. And so they will be naturally selected. And so you probably have heard this phrase, the survival of the fittest. And it's not a phrase that came from Darwin, and it wasn't one that Darwin particularly liked. And it's very misleading, because you have to know what is fittest. Sometimes the fittest or what the fittest individual is the strongest individual, sometimes there are other types of fitness. So there's lots of different types of fitness. And so what matters is passing on genes. So if you can pass your genes on at higher frequency, which means you have more offspring, then you basically win the game of evolution. And so let's look at some examples of fitness. Antibiotic resistance is one type. So some bacteria, like Staphylococcus aureus, are resistant to antibiotics. So when an antibiotic is applied, in the case of Staphylococcus aureus, they cause wound infections. So when an antibiotic is applied, those less fit are going to be killed, and those most fit, those that have the antibiotic resistance, will survive and reproduce and pass on their genes for antibiotic resistance. And so that's one example of fitness. Another is parental care. Here are starlings, sometimes called the rats of the bird world. They are very prolific. They carry diseases that infect other birds as well as other animals, and they also push out native species. They were introduced into America, into Central Park in New York City in the late 1800s by a well-meaning lover of Shakespeare who wanted to introduce to America all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. And so I think there was about 100 birds released into Central Park in the late 1800s, and since that time they have spread throughout America and up into Canada and down into Mexico too. So they've been very, very successful. And one of the keys to their success is that they are very good parents. Both of the parents, the mother and father, both take care of their chicks. They both feed them, and they very aggressively guard their nests. So this is another example of fitness, being good parents. And that allows them to pass on their genes at a higher frequency. And then kind of the opposite is with cuckoo birds, and also cowbirds. And what the cowbirds do, or the cuckoos, will lay an egg in the nest of another bird, a different species, and then they just abandon the egg. And then the egg is taken care of by the foster parents, the unwitting foster parents. And when the chicks hatch, they tend to be bigger than the other chicks. The cuckoos and the cowbird chicks are fairly large. And so because it's a larger chick, the foster parents will preferentially feed that chick over their own, because they'll feed the biggest chick. And the other chicks get neglected. They starve, fall out of the nest, whatever. And then this cuckoo strategy is successful. So here's another example of fitness. This is kind of the anti-starling strategy. Instead of taking care of the young, the young are abandoned. But because birds have the bird brains, basically, they don't realize the difference between a cuckoo or a cowbird chick and their own, and then they take care of those chicks, and that's a successful strategy for passing on genes. And then another example has to do with mimicry, and this is a bluegill male, and the males come in two forms. There's the big masculine kind, like this one, and then there are bluegill males that look like females. And so the way fish reproduce is that the female lays eggs in a nest, and the male will come along and releases sperm on the eggs, and that fertilizes the eggs. And then the male will guard the nest and chase away any other males that might want to come in and fertilize the eggs. And so, but what happens is while the big male is fertilizing or guarding the nest, the males that look like females can venture in, can sort of sneak in, and the bluegill male, the big male, doesn't recognize the female-looking male as a threat. He just sees it as a female. And so what the female-looking male will then do is release his sperm over the eggs too. So at least some of the eggs will become fertilized by the female-looking male. And so in this case, the strategy is being sneaky. And so being a mimic of a big male and being sneaky. So fitness varies all over the map, and there's lots of interesting examples, and I encourage you to do some research and find some other examples too. So so there was a number of things that were unique about Darwin's theory, and the first one is there was no direction. Those who are best fit for the struggle in a particular environment tend to survive and reproduce at a higher frequency. And so if the environment changes, then those who are best fit for the previous environment may not be so fit for the changed environment. And so there's no guarantees. And so evolution does not have a goal. There's no goal for evolution. And this was a problem. This was a big problem for Darwin's theory, or the acceptance of Darwin's theory, because this was a time during Darwin's day when the Industrial Revolution was going full bore. And so there were new factories with new machinery, there were new technologies. A little bit later, the telephone was invented. Automobiles were just around the corner. Trains were invented during Darwin's day, and the telegraph and all kinds of other inventions were pushing society forward. And so this was seen as progress, making life better for humans in a number of ways. And so progress was seen as good. But Darwin's theory doesn't allow for progress. There's no direction. Like I said, if the environment changes, it sort of reshuffles the deck. And what was successful in a previous environment might not be successful in the new environment. And the other thing too is that what many other of the theories of evolution that were being put forward, besides Darwin's theory of natural selection, always showed humans as the ultimate goal of evolution. Evolution was directed toward humans. And Darwin said, no, there's nothing inevitable about the evolution of humans. And so the natural selection part was basically rejected during Darwin's lifetime. But again, everyone who was thinking and open-minded and read Darwin's book were convinced of the fact of evolution. It was just the theory that wasn't accepted initially. And then in Darwin's theory, the population is the unit of evolution. Variations arise in individuals, and it's when those variations spread within a population and become fixed that evolution occurs. So if a variation arises in an individual, but they don't pass on their genes, then that's not evolution. It's when those variations spread in a population that evolution occurs. And then the key to selection is competition. Competition for limited resources results in the selection of those most fit and the elimination of those less fit. And then another thing was common ancestry, although this was not new with Darwin. Even Darwin's grandfather had suggested that all life shares a common ancestor. And this has been confirmed by genetic studies. When you do genetic studies, it's like looking back into the family history to see who's your great-great-great-great-grandmother. So you can do genetic studies in the same sort of way. And all the genetic studies points back to a single common ancestor. And that single common ancestor has the acronym LUCA, which stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. All right, so the first chapter of Darwin's book was on artificial selection, and he had a good reason for doing this, and it was a very smart selection on his part, so to speak. In artificial selection, humans breed organisms for desirable traits. And this could be for traits that are beneficial to humans. For example, more nutritious, more tasty foods, animals that produce more milk or more meat or whatever. But it may also be just for traits that humans find pleasurable. And during Darwin's day, pigeon breeding was a very popular hobby. And so Darwin studied a lot about pigeon breeding, and the parental species for all of the pigeon breeding were the rock pigeons. And these are just the common pigeons we see on the street, in the city streets and so forth. And so what people started doing was breeding rock pigeons for things like color and the number of tail feathers. And so they would have, they would present these fancy pigeons in county fairs and so forth, and they'd have contests and all that kind of stuff. And so, this showed that that species could change. So you could change a rock pigeon into a fancy pigeon through selective breeding. And an even better example is dogs. The variation in dogs is not matched by any other species. If you look at the different types of dogs and consider, compare this with cats. And cat breeding has been going on for a long time, but we don't see this kind of variation in cat breeds. And so dogs are really an amazing species in terms of the variation that can arise through selective breeding. And all the evidence points to dogs having evolved from wolves. And currently it's about the evolution goes back to about 20,000 years. The first dogs came about around that time. But many of the breeds we have today, especially these miniature breeds, came about because of a particular dog called the Pekingese. And the Pekingese was a dog that came from China, and it was introduced in England, I believe it was in the 1840s, and it caused a huge sensation. Everybody who was anybody wanted to have a Pekingese dog. And this brought about an interest in breeding dogs in general, not for work-related things, which is what dogs were mainly used for before the Pekingese came on the scene, but just for style and just for kind of the hobby of breeding dogs for different traits. And so now we have big dogs and little dogs, floppy ears and straight ears, and all kinds of different variations. Unfortunately, what has happened with these breeding hobbies is that it takes a lot of inbreeding for this to be successful. And what this has done is led to some serious genetic disorders. Pretty much every breed of dog has a particular genetic disorder that plagues their breed. But so what Darwin said was, look what can be done in a short amount of time with selective breeding. And so imagine what nature could do with lots of time. With millions of years, you could get species as different as humans and horses. And so Darwin kind of used this as an analogy for natural selection, but it is the case that the key to selection, whether it's natural selection or artificial selection, is genetic mutations. So it's really the same kind of evolution, just sort of on a different scale. So this artificial selection leads to evolution just as natural selection does. And genetic mutation creates heritable variation. But this is something Darwin didn't know, and this was another problem for his theory, because he didn't have a good explanation for how this heritable variation arose. It arises through genetic mutation, and if a genetic mutation is beneficial, then that can be selected for, rather, or either in artificial selection or through natural selection. And so artificial selection showed in a simple and relatable way how organisms can change over time. And this discussion of artificial selection acted as a stepping stone to the acceptance of natural selection. And so people in Darwin's day did a lot of this hobby breeding, but there was also a lot of farmers too. And so they knew what Darwin was talking about. They knew about breeding programs and how they can be successful. And so it sort of was a hook to people in those days. And it really worked because, again, evolution was accepted very quickly after Darwin's book, and it made a big splash. Okay, so another chapter in Darwin's book dealt with taxonomy. And the father of modern taxonomy is Linnaeus, lived in the 18th century. And Linnaeus looked like he was a really nice kind of guy. And his system of taxonomy was based on reproductive structures. And if you think about it, this was a very smart thing to pick, because reproductive structures don't change much over time. If reproductive structures changed, if male and female parts changed significantly, then they're not going to work. Linnaeus was mainly a botanist, and if you think about pollen and eggs, the eggs, or rather pollen and carpels, then if the pollen isn't the right type for a particular carpel, then there's not going to be reproduction. And another good example is snakes. Male snakes have a sort of a key-shaped penis, and that key will only fit particular locks. And so they stay within their species because that's where there's a good fit. You're not going to ever cross an elephant with a mouse because their reproductive structures just aren't going to fit together. And so reproductive structures stay constant, or relatively constant over time, or else the species is not going to be able to reproduce, and that'll be the end of the species. So it was a good choice for what to base his system on. And Linnaeus invented lots of taxa, and taxon means a taxonomic category or a classification category, and taxa is plural. So he invented a lot of the taxa we use today. We'll go over a few of those. And he also invented binomial nomenclature. Binomial means two names, and nomenclature means a system. So this is a system consisting of two names for each species. So for example, our species is Homo sapiens. Homo is our genus. Homo sapiens is our species. So we never say sapiens is our species. We always use two words, Homo sapiens, and that comes from Linnaeus. And Linnaeus, by the way, invented our species name, Homo sapiens. And so here we have the various taxa, and most of these Linnaeus invented. And this is a sort of a family tree, if you will, of the American black bear, Ursus americanus. And what Darwin saw when he looked at these taxonomic trees, so to speak, was a relatedness from the least inclusive taxon to the most inclusive. So species or individuals within a species are most closely related, but they're also related to genera with related species. And so, for example, in the genus Ursus, there are black bears, there are grizzly bears, there are polar bears, and other types of bears. And they have so many similarities, so many homologies, that it's very common sense to say they shared a common ancestor. And likewise, when you go from genus to family, there are families of genera, which is the plural of genus. There are families of genera that are also related. The genera are related more closely to each other than they are to other genera in different schemes, in different families, and then so forth and so on. Next is the order, next is the class, phylum, kingdom, and domain. And so this is like a big family tree. You can think of this as siblings within the species, and then parents come to the genus, and then grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth. And so it's the same sort of concept. You find relatedness from species all the way to domain. And this is confirmed by genetic studies. That's mostly how taxonomy is done today, is by doing things like DNA, sort of DNA profiling and other sort of DNA analyses. And it confirms what Linnaeus had put together, although he didn't quite accept this the way I'm saying it, that there's relatedness throughout the taxa. But Darwin did see it, and he was the first one to recognize that, and he included taxonomy as a chapter because he considered it to be evidence for evolution. And another thing Linnaeus did was name thousands of species, including Homo sapiens, but he also named a lot of the other taxon level names too. And this is basically what I've been talking about, relational. Okay, so these are related. This hierarchy from species to domain, we find relatedness throughout the entire scheme. And so what I'm going to do is give you an example of Homo sapiens, and this is something that you should commit to memory. And once we go through it, I'll back up and I'll show you how it's not that difficult. So the most inclusive domain is eukarya, and this is a characteristic of eukarya is that all eukaryotes have organelles. And then within domains are kingdoms, And the kingdom in which Homo sapiens is Animalia. Lots of animals. So look around you and you'll see lots of animals, and they're all in the kingdom Animalia. And one of the things that distinguishes animals from others kingdoms is no cell walls. And then there are other characteristics too, but I'm just naming one or two. And then within kingdoms, there's phyla, and we're in the phylum Chordata, which consists mostly of vertebrates. A few invertebrates, but mostly vertebrates. And then the class we're in is Mammalia, and mammals nurse their young with mammary glands. And this is one of those categories that Linnaeus came up with, and he lived, you can see when he lived, and he was Swedish, and in his day, society was pretty uptight about sexual kind of things, and it was kind of shocking that he used this term, mammalia, to describe the group that Homo sapiens is in. And the reason he did this was because during his day, the women in high society, the upper 1%, when they would have a baby, what they would do is pass that baby on to a wet nurse. And so the mother, the actual mother, wouldn't nurse the baby. She'd give the baby up at birth to a wet nurse, and then she'd go out and, whatever she did, go to parties, go shopping, whatever. And so the wet nurse would nurse the baby. And Linnaeus was kind of horrified by this, not so much because of the neglect of the mother, but because wet nurses tend to be of the poorer classes. And Linnaeus was concerned that this would in some way contaminate the children, and the wet nurses might pass on their lower class status to these babies. And so he was sending out a signal to society that this is something that shouldn't be done, that mammary glands should be respected, so to speak, and that this was it was sort of an honorific name to name this class Mammalia. But anyway, then the order we're in is primates, and primates include monkeys, apes, lemurs, etc. And biologically, we are most closely related to the apes. And notice there's a difference between apes and monkeys, and that's sort of a pet peeve of mine. Please don't ever call chimpanzees or gorillas or orangutans or humans monkeys. We're all apes. And then family Hominidae, which includes the great apes and extinct hominids. And again, the great apes are the humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. And then Homo is our genus. Big brains, bipedal is two characteristics of our genus. And then species, Homo sapiens, we're the only species that cuts their hair. You never see a hair salon for chimpanzees. They're just all for humans. So this seems possibly like a big task to do to memorize all this good stuff, but it's really not that hard. We've already gone over eukaryotes quite a bit and domain eukarya, so you probably know that already and know about organelles. The kingdom is animal kingdom, nothing hard about that. And that's, and again, when we talked about cells, we talked about animals having no cell walls. And then the phylum Chordata, that's maybe a new word, but these are mostly vertebrates. And vertebrates is probably a term you're familiar with. And then mammals, you know mammals, and you know what that refers to, nursing young. And primates, I assume you've heard of the primates. and those are, like I said, monkeys, apes, and other related species. And so this is probably a new one too, hominidae. But again, there's the home part of it, like homo, hominidae, and those are the great apes and extinct hominids. And you probably know that the species name Homo sapiens, you just have to connect this to genus. That's our genus. And again, that's pretty easy to remember. We've got big brains, and we're bipedal. We walk on 2 feet. Okay, so the most definitive way to show taxonomic relationships is through DNA homologies, and we've talked about this before too. And recall that there are both coding and non-coding sequences, and probably should say coding and non-coding DNA sequences. And recall that the coding DNA sequences actually code for proteins and other things, while the non-coding don't. And the non-coding sequences are commonly called junk DNA, although there's reasons to not call it junk DNA. But regardless, non-coding sequences, because they're not coding for proteins, can change or mutate without affecting the proteins or whatever else the genes are coding for. So they tend to accumulate lots of mutations, and so non-coding sequences tend to be highly variable. Coding sequences, on the other hand, are pretty important, and you don't want to keep changing proteins, or you're going to end up with some sort of bad combination that's going to end up just killing the species. So coding sequences, bottom line, don't change much. So if you're going to look for taxonomic relationships between individuals that are close, like within the same species, or maybe even between related species in genera, then you use non-coding sequences. If you're going to look at relationships between something like a species, or like a bear and a mouse or whatever, species that are distantly related, then you'd use coding sequences, because there's not going to be that much change between the coding sequences. One example is with the hemoglobin protein between humans and rhesus monkeys. There are only 8 amino acid differences, and so there are only 8 different places in the coding DNA sequences that are different between us and the monkey, the rhesus monkey, and so when you compare us and monkeys, you'd be using non-coding sequences, because there's not very many differences between our genes. If you're looking at comparing humans with frogs, and looking at the hemoglobin molecule again, there are probably hundreds of different differences between us and our human hemoglobin and frog hemoglobin. And so in that case, you use coding DNA sequences. Okay, another chapter in Darwin's book was on the fossil record. And during Darwin's day, fossil record was pretty poor. There was one intriguing fossil, and that was Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx was about the size of a crow, and it had, this is an actual fossil, it had characteristics of both reptiles and birds. And so it had a long bony tail like a reptile, it had teeth like a reptile, but a lot of the other parts of its structure were bird-like. And so this is considered a bird-like dinosaur. Not a missing link, but one that had characteristics of both. And then there's lots of dinosaur fossils. in Darwin's day, but no one really made a connection between dinosaurs and modern species. And then Neanderthals were also Neanderthal fossils were also discovered during this time, around the publication of The Origin of Species. And this is an artist's conception. Obviously, it's not a real Neanderthal. But many in Darwin's day took this this fossil to be a missing link between humans and apes. And Darwin was a lot more cautious, and rightfully so, because it turns out that this is not an ancestor of humans, but rather a cousin of humans. And there's good evidence that Neanderthals and humans interbred at least several times in the past. And most Europeans carry between 2 and 3% Neanderthal DNA. So if you're of European descent, then it's very likely you're carrying some Neanderthal in you. And then, but there was an overall trend in the fossil record, as there is still today, that from the oldest fossils to the youngest fossils, they went from simple to complex. So the very oldest fossils are single-celled, and then quite a bit later, you start to get colonies of cells, and then later you get multi-celled organisms, and then the sophistication increases. And it's just a general thing that if you start off simple and keep working at it, you're going to get more and more complex. So that was visible in the fossil record. But Darwin admitted that the fossil record was pretty poor, and there needed to be more fossils. Today, we have a wealth of fossil evidence. And while there are still gaps in the fossil record, we don't know everything for sure, that there are a lot of fossils that show evolutionary sequences. For example, whales from land animals to water creatures that they are today. There's a good fossil record. And there's also a very good fossil record for humans as well, from ape-like creatures to modern humans. One rather recent fossil, I believe this was first discovered in the 1970s, is Tiktaalik, and it's been called a fishapod, and it lived about 375 million years ago. And Tiktaalik has features of both fish and amphibians. It has lungs, which would allow it to breathe on land, and it also has its flippers have the same bones in it that we have, and so it was able to scoot itself on the land from the water. So this is sort of an in-between organism, in between a reptile, in between a fish and an amphibian. The way the fossil record goes for vertebrates, fish came first, followed by amphibians, followed by reptiles, and mammals and birds around the same time. And then regarding our evolutionary line, primates like monkeys came, and then after them apes, and then humans. Okay, another chapter in Darwin's book was on biogeography, and biogeographers study what lives where and why. And so what Darwin said, that animals and plants of a region are most closely related to those of nearby regions and reflect the history of the region. So the environment, similar environments can or let me say it this way, similar environments can lead to the evolution of similar body plans. And so, for example, if we look in the southwest of the United States, we can find cactus growing in the deserts. And then if we look in the deserts of South Africa, we find a plant that looks very similar to this. This is a spurge, and you can see that there's a lot of similarities. This is sort of the ribbed structure of the body of the plant, and the leaves are actually the spines, and they both have spines. So they look very similar. They look like they could be related, but they're not. They're not closely related at all. Spurge is related to the Christmas plant, the poinsettia, and cactus is not closely related to that at all. If we could see the flowers, again, the reproductive structures, we'd see that the flowers of cacti are very different than the flowers of the spurge. So the environment can shape organisms to look the same, but they're more closely related to organisms in their environment rather than in other environments that may be similar. And this is called convergent evolution. And if you go to the PowerPoint and click here, you'll find more examples of convergent evolution. One other example is dolphins and sharks. They live in similar environments in the ocean, and they have taken on similar body shapes. So that's one more example of how the environment can shape body plans. And so a big one was homology. And this is where you really find the strongest evidence for evolution. And a homology is a similarity so strong that it's not likely due to chance. And so the first one I want to talk about is anatomical, and specifically the forelimbs of various vertebrates. And if you look at the forelimbs of humans, lizards, cats, whales, bats, frogs, and birds, and many, many others, in fact, all vertebrates, and including Tiktaalik, also the same thing. Will have the same bones in its forelimbs. And so all of these creatures have the same bones, arranged in the same way. The shape varies a bit, but they're still the same bones. And they're used for different purposes. So humans for reaching and manipulating objects, lizards and cats for walking, whales for swimming, bats and birds for flying, and frogs for jumping. And so they're the same structure, but they all have different functions. And so this is a similarity between these different species that's so strong that it's not likely due to chance. And the best explanation is that all these creatures shared a common ancestor, and from that common ancestor they inherited the bones in their forelimbs. And then another type of homology is biochemical. We have talked about glycolysis. Recall that glycolysis is the first part of aerobic respiration, and anaerobic respiration, as well as fermentation. And so all living creatures on Earth do glycolysis. And if you look at the pathway, the biochemical pathway of glycolysis, it's highly complex. And again, the best scientific explanation for why all living organisms share the same biochemical pathways is evolution. This is not likely. It's not likely that every living creature on Earth, by chance, have the same biochemical pathway for glycolysis. A much better explanation scientifically is that it is evolution. All right, so one more homology, DNA homologies, and again, this is the ultimate. DNA homologies are really the definitive way to tell who's most closely related to whom. And so let's look at us and chimps. And first of all, when we look at we put the DNA side by side, we find that 96 to 98% of the DNA is the same. And this includes coding and non-coding sequences. So that's pretty stark. And let me just explain what you're looking at here. Here are our 23 pairs of chromosomes next to the chromosomes of chimpanzees. And chimpanzees have 24 pairs of chromosomes, whereas we have 23. And so that would seem to be a big difference. But here we see our chromosome 2 lined up with chromosome 12 and 13 of the chimpanzee. And these black banding patterns are areas that are rich in the nucleotides G and C. Remember, there are 4 nucleotides that are the building blocks of DNA, A, T, C, and G. And so these are C and G rich bands. And when you look at the banding patterns, they pretty closely match up. And when we look at chromosome 2 and 12 and 13 of the chimpanzees and put them together, the banding patterns match up. And so the hypothesis is that our common ancestor had, like the chimpanzee, 24 pairs of chromosomes, and then somewhere along the line to humans, once there was a split between humans and chimpanzees, which occurred about 5 million years ago, chromosome 12 and 13 fused before modern humans evolved. And so what we see here with our chromosome 2 is a fusion of chromosome 12 and 13. And I want to emphasize that this is not saying that we evolved from chimps. The evidence does not support that. The evidence supports that we evolved from a common ancestor. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor. We didn't evolve from chimpanzees, nor they from us. And so when we look a little bit closer at chromosome 2 and chromosome 12 and 13, besides the banding patterns, there are a couple of other stark similarities or homologies. Recall centromeres. When during interphase before mitosis or before meiosis, chromosomes replicate and they're held together at the centromeres. And so that's their point of attachment. So here's the centromere for our chromosome 2, and here is the centromere for, I believe it's chromosome 12. And notice they line up. But if our chromosome 2 is a fusion of chromosome 12 and 13, there should be a second centromere. And what do you know? Here it is. And it lines up with the centromere of chromosome 13 of the chimpanzee. But it's non-functional. It's a non-functional centromere, but it still is easily identified as a centromere. It's a non-functional centromere. And then on either end of a chromosome, in the colors, there's purple and red, there are nucleotide caps called telomeres. And basically what telomeres do is protect the chromosome from unraveling, so to speak. Not exactly, but just go with it. And so it's analogous to a structure called an aglet, A-G-L-E-T, which occur on shoelaces. So that little plastic thing on the end of a shoelace is called an aglet, and that protects the shoelace from unraveling. And likewise, chromosomes at either end have telomeres. So here's one at one end of the chromosome 2 and the other end of the chromosome 2, and the same thing for chromosome 13. There's one on either end, and chromosome 12, there's one on either end. And so if our chromosome 2 is a fusion of 12 and 13, then there should be a place on our chromosome 2 where we find 2 telomeres fused together. And there it is. And again, it lines up with the 12 and 13 telomeres. So this is pretty strong evidence that we shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees, and that our chromosome 2 is a fusion of 12 and 13. And the best way to explain it is through evolution. And then we have in our genome genes that have basically become fossils, genes that were used in the past but have become mutated and no longer function. And one of these genes is the vitamin C gene. Most mammals have the ability to make their own vitamin C, but primates do not. Primates lost the ability to make their own vitamin C because they started eating fruits and so forth that were high in vitamin C. So we were supplying the vitamin C that we needed through the food we ate, and so we didn't need the vitamin C gene to produce vitamin C for us. So in genetics and evolution, there's a phrase, use it or lose it. So because we weren't using the vitamin C gene, it mutated, it accumulated mutations and became non-functional. And that's what happens with genes that we no longer use. They'll mutate and become non-functional. And so when we line up vitamin C genes from, or vitamin C gene fossils from humans, chimps, orangutans, and macaques, a type of monkey, we see, and I'm not going to hang here too long, but if you can look at this for yourself, you can see that humans and chimps have mutations in the exact same place. And so again, it's not very likely that that happened by chance. It's more likely that this is a result of evolution, that we shared a common ancestor whose vitamin C gene mutated, and then that fossil gene was passed on to both humans and chimps. Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and next time we'll resume with another category of homologies and move on and eventually get to sexual selection, which I find to be the most fascinating part of evolution. So that's all for now, the end of part 1.